So unfortunately, we have another data and number specific presentation. So just endless data, end after end. The good news is you'll all have copies eventually of these reports. In the next couple of weeks or so, we will be publishing the full report, so you'll be able to dive in more deeply. Appreciated the opportunity to work on this project with the Workforce Development Board. Because we have the rich and deep data from the 2021 census, we're able to go a lot deeper and do a much deeper dive, as you'll see here, on the structure and state of the workforce here in the Chatham-Kent area. I will say the pandemic did sort of disrupt that census a bit. So for example, the unemployment rate was a lot higher than it probably should have been. Probably didn't affect participation rates because unemployed people are included in workforce participation. So just keep that in mind as we go through some of this data. So this was the report mandate. So basically to provide a current state on the workforce with trends and issues facing the workforce, some of the causes of workforce shortages. So we look at some of that data in here. The report draws on multiple sources, heavily on StatsCan, but also the Employer One survey and the Job Demand Report. The Employer One survey in here is much more limited than what Jason provided, so there's really, really good data in the report that he's done. And it was commissioned to address a recommendation in the 2021-2022 local labor market planning document. So what are some of the key findings? Well, the key finding number one is we have record low unemployment. And again, this is difference between the census and the ongoing annual labor force survey that's done. And so according to Stats Canada, the unemployment rate across the municipality in 2022 was only 4.3%. So we had some debate among the team about that number, but having reviewed it, looked at it in more detail, looked at adjacent markets here, Sarnia, Windsor, and others, I still believe that is the number. And if you look at just the total number of people unemployed in an average month during the year, Stats Canada was estimating, using their survey, it was about 2,200, or a drop of 58% in the last decade. So we're seeing just a fundamental reduction in the unemployment here. So the hardcore absolute unemployment in the community. And again, that survey is based on the average annual or average monthly numbers over the course of the year. So the key finding number two is that job vacancies are up sharply. So if you look at the economic region, the Windsor-Sarnia economic region, we have really good data on that from StatsCan. The job vacancies overall are up 157% between 2015 and 2022. So the pandemic influenced that somewhat in a fairly significant way, but that trend predates the pandemic. Health occupations vacancies are up 4 times, so 400%. Trades-related vacancies up more than 2 times, and laborers, assemblers vacancies up 2.7 times. So we're seeing lots of vacancies across most sectors of the economy. When we look specifically at this region, and again, I won't break into this too much detail on this because Jason did a good job of that, but 60% plus of our employers are having trouble recruiting staff, hard to fill positions. And as Jason mentioned, the hardest positions to fill were a mix of labor, financial, and healthcare. And again, 39% either didn't receive enough applicants, 10% actually didn't receive any applicants during the course of the year for the job on offer. And then technical skills and required qualifications were another perceived barrier. So, not to go into every number here, I can give you a copy of the slide deck here, but it's important to understand that the vacancies or the hard to fill jobs are across a wide spectrum. So I study labor markets across Canada, and thriving labor markets meet demand across the spectrum. So we always talk about skilled labor, we talk about all kinds of professional labor, we talk about all kinds of labor, but at the end of the day, a thriving and successful workforce will meet demand across the spectrum, from part-time workers in food service to IT workers to professional occupations in healthcare. So when we look at the top 10 hard-to-fill jobs, they represent that spectrum. So food service, counter attendants, home support workers, retail salespersons, but also nurses and registered practical nurses, and then down to things like truck drivers and general farm workers. So we'll talk a little bit about the implications of that as we move forward, but as we look to plan for the labor market, we have to think about the sources of labor for these various occupations. So the key finding number 3 from the work, and this is based partially on the census, but partially on the jobs on offer. So there seems to be a bit of a general alignment of education among younger workers to workforce demand. So just at the highest level, if you look at the education requirements for Knox skill A, B, C, and D, and you look at the jobs on offer, the percentages are pretty consistent. So what this means is if you had sort of 50% of your workforce at skill A and only 24% of the jobs, you'd have a lot of overqualified people relative to the job. So that's what that's trying to tell you. And you'll see there's a lot of detail on that in the report. So key finding number 4, there are some education gaps. So the census does break down the workforce by detailed educational level. And what you see when I basically compared it by age cohort, you'll see that in the report, when you look at the age cohort 25 to 34, it's less educated than the cohort above them, 35 to 54, in a number of interesting occupational groups. These are 4 I pull out: education, business management and public administration, math and computer science, architecture, engineering, and related. So some of that is chicken and egg. If I get my computer science degree and there's no jobs here, I'll move to Toronto or London or somewhere where there's IT jobs. But on the other hand, if the workforce isn't producing those skills, then companies in that sector are less likely to hire here. So that's a complicating factor, but it's important to understand that our younger workforce in this region, in this area, is not as educated in these 4 categories relative to their peers in the older age cohort. Key finding number 5, so about 35% are heading toward retirement. So you talked about 20% from the Employer One survey, but if you look at everybody that declared employment income in 2020, which is where this comes from, if you break that out by age group, about 35% of those folks are over the age of 55, and that's about 20,000 people. So there's other data that would say that's 13 or 14,000, but when you look at the actual number of people that earn employment income during the year, the census would tell us that's about 20,000. So that's a huge number, and all those folks are going to be retiring or heading out of the workforce in the next 10 or 15 years. Now, the good news is, in this community, 1 in 3 age 65 is participating in the workforce. So we already have a history. I think that has something to do with the farming sector, partially. Farmers tend to never retire. But it is good news that we are seeing people staying in the workforce longer, and that will be one of my recommendations. If you look at the NOC occupations, the high-level NOC occupational groups, this just shows you the 55 plus, and all of this is in the report, so no need to write this down. Just important to understand that, for example, 41% of everybody employed in the natural resources related occupations is over the age of 55, so they will be retiring. Maybe not in 10 years, but in the next 10 to 15 years or more. Key finding number 6, the total workforce demand through 2030 will exceed 18,000. So I did some work last year for the Western Ontario Wardens Caucus, and we did this analysis for all of the region here, including Chatham-Kent. I just updated that for this report. These are always challenging because you never know what's going to happen. It's very hard to predict 5 and 10 years out, but based on the best data we have, the best understanding we have, we are looking that probably between 2021 and 2030, we're going to need to fill about 18,000 net jobs from replacement demand and growth demand. So that assumes about 80% of that workforce will retire, and assumes a moderate growth demand of 2,200. So that's based on MC's forecast of employment between 2021 and 2028. So that results in 18,000, or equivalent to about 30% of the 2021 workforce. So this is unprecedented. If you went back 10 years, the number would be about half that. So we're going to see a dramatic increase, and I'm going to talk about implications of that in a minute. Now, the good news is, if we do convince a larger share of the 55 and even 65-year-old folks to stay in the workforce, that reduces our need to attract workers. So this is just breaking that down by occupational group. So you'll see here, for example, business, finance, and administration, there's no expected growth demand, but a fairly significant demand from replacement or retirement. And health occupations, a bit of both. We're going to see strong growth, but we're also going to see some folks retiring from the workforce. So the key finding number 7 is that Chatham-Kent's population is growing, but likely not fast enough to meet this demand that we just talked about. So the good news is, and we saw the 2021 numbers earlier, the actual 2022 numbers saw another uptick, another couple of thousand added to the population just in the last year as well. So that's good news. Assuming the Ontario Ministry of Finance projections are correct, the working age population in Chatham-Kent is expected to decline by 3,300 between 2021 and 2030. And again, the department has the same challenges that all of us have when we're trying to forecast these things. So if you look at that, the growth demand that we talked about earlier, all things being equal, the municipality will be about 5,500 people short in terms of labor demand between 2021 and 2030. So that will have to be brought in, again, understanding the limitations of this model, but as a thought experiment, 5,500 at least will need to be brought in by 2030. So what are the risks? Well, I've studied a lot of this for communities across the country, and the risks are the export industries go first, the ones that don't have to be here. So that would be your trucking companies, that would be your manufacturers, that would be any industry that can actually do what they're doing here in other communities. They start to disinvest first. And then after that, you actually start to see disinvestment in industries that have to be here. So what they do is they move down the road. So we're seeing that in other parts of the country where some services are consolidating in the larger urban centers. So if we don't meet the demand here in Chatham-Kent, in 10 years you may have to drive to Windsor or to London to access services that you can access in the community today. So it's not just about the exporters, it's also about the service providers. So that's the apocalyptic scenario. As the mayor said earlier, we're seeing growth, we're seeing people moving into this community, so I think there's a really good case that this community can attract the talent that we need. The key finding number 8 is the sources of population growth are changing. So if you went back 20 years, even 10 years, we had a positive natural population growth, so more births and deaths every year in the community, and of course that shifted to negative a few years ago. And so now we're more reliant, at least in the short term, in terms of bringing people in, if we want to actually grow that population. You'll see in the report we do a detailed analysis of where that population is coming from, but most of it is still coming from that corridor between Toronto and Windsor. Toronto, on a net basis, is our top source. This is the 3-year annual average between 2020 and 2022. Outside the CMA, CA area here in Ontario, so that's the more rural communities, and then you can see Windsor, Hamilton, Kitchener, and so on. So those are the top sources. So we actually have a negative migration to Sarnia. So we'll have to roll up our sleeves. I'm not sure why we're losing more population to Sarnia than we're gaining. Let's work on that. Key finding number 9, Chatham-Kent is starting to attract young people. So I mentioned it to Jason earlier. If you look at the 2022 numbers, the median age in Chatham-Kent actually ticked down for the first time in probably 25 years. So we actually are technically slightly younger now in 2022 by 1/10. But that's the result of this inflow of young people. So this chart shows you the net inward population movement. That's from all sources: immigrants, intra-provincial migration, and so on. If you look at those numbers, you look at that, 0 to 14 years, we had a plus migration of 411. So that's basically young families. I don't think those 13-year-olds are moving here by themselves. It's possible. But for the most part, that means young families coming here looking for cheaper housing because there's a career opportunity here. So that's really, really good news. And that is a change. We've got the numbers in the report here. If you look at the 2011-2012 year, you can see the total difference, right? We had a steep decline in the 15 to 44 age group. And in last year, we had a big increase. So that's really, really good news. And it's a momentum that we need to continue to foster, even coming out of this, fully coming out of this pandemic. And the way you do that is by having access to reasonably priced housing. It's a huge, huge issue in this community and across Ontario. Key finding number 10, young people are not pursuing careers in several important local industries. So again, one of the things we can do with the census is we can break all this stuff down by age group. And so if you look at the ratio of workers under the age of 30 to workers over the age of 55 by occupation, and there's an appendix with every major occupational group listed. But here's just a few that are pulled out. There's very few young truck drivers. So there's only 9 truck drivers, and that includes taxis, but truck drivers and taxis, and also like the delivery drivers. 9 of those folks for every, under the age of 30 for every 100 over the age of 55. So that workforce is predominantly older, but we're not seeing the inflow of young people either. If you look at the farming sector, equal problem. But even things like the school system. So there are 46 secondary school teachers under the age of 30 for every 100 over the age of 55. So ideally, you'd want that ratio better balanced. because you need, every one that ticks off on that end, you need one coming in this end. Now, some of these professions are better at pulling people from other communities than others. And there are 33 social and community services professionals under the age of 30 for every 100 over the age of 55. So take a look at that when the report comes out. But it's another key indicator of the state of our challenge. If we're not able to attract young people into these occupations, it's going to bode not well as we look to the future. So Chatham-Kent is likely needs to attract more immigrants. I say likely there because you are attracting a lot from other parts of the province. Now, those intra-provincial migrants can be immigrants if they settled first in, say, Toronto or Windsor. So in the data, we don't know if they're immigrants. They could be immigrants. But at the end of the day, I think we're going to have to attract more. If you look at the workforce, the number of immigrants and non-permanent residents in the workforce did increase between 2016 and 2021, which is really good news. But the non-immigrant workforce declined by 1,000, just under 1,000. So as more born in Canada decline, you're going to have to make that up with internationally born workers. So if you look at London, for example, and Windsor, they killed it over the last census period. They saw a 38% increase in their immigrant and non-permanent resident workforce, and Windsor saw a 44% increase. And what that means is the workforce in both of those communities grew substantially faster than here in Chatham-Kent, and there's a lot of data on that in detail in the report. So just a couple more here, because you must be overwhelmed with all this data. Key finding number 12, there are some gaps in the workforce. So we talked earlier about women in the workforce. We speculated on that. There's a lot of potential reasons. Could be economic. They could be more pressured in the urban centers to work than here, or it could be access to childcare. There's a variety of reasons why that is, but nevertheless, we do have considerably fewer women aged 25 to 34 in the workforce. The Indigenous population here, which is relatively small, and we've got a big section on that in the report, but it does have a lower participation rate. So we could look to our Indigenous partners, our Indigenous or First Nations communities to think about ways to support them through training to get more of those folks in the workforce. Immigrants have a much lower workforce participation rate, and some of this might have been the result of the pandemic, not sure, but that is an issue as well. And again, the immigrant numbers are relatively small, so in absolute terms, these aren't large numbers. And then a potential, I say concern here, it's not really a concern, but it's a potential implication for workforce development. So about 14% of our 25 to 34-year-olds have not completed high school, and that's about double the rate across the province in that age cohort. So for some reason, we have a larger share. And again, in absolute terms, the numbers aren't large, but still, it's not particularly good to have 14% of your 25 to 34-year-olds without any formal education, high school or otherwise. And the other thing is we have about 30% more of our adults receive social assistance benefits compared to the province overall. And again, that might indicate a potential pool of labor with the right incentives, with the right skills, with the right training of that workforce. And we do look at persons with disabilities as well, just that there's really limited data from Stats Canada right now on that workforce at the local level. We have data here on the provincial level. Key finding number 13, less folks in this community are engaged in post-secondary education, and I just want to remind you that in the census, if you're studying in Toronto or studying in Windsor, it's where you live, where your permanent residency is where where you're listed from a census perspective. So most people in school, not all, but most people in school are listed, if they're from here, they're probably listed as residents of Chatham-Kent from a census perspective. But among the 20 to 24 age cohort, the share in Chatham-Kent enrolled in any kind of post-secondary education, college, apprenticeships, any kind of trades-related training or university is 1/3 less. I got that wrong. I think I've written that wrong. It's 34% here compared to 51% across the province. So it's 1/3 less than the province. Among the population aged 25 to 64, there's about twice as many across the province attending some form of post-secondary education compared to the population here. So we have less, bottom line is we have less people in post-secondary education in our region, and that might have something to do with the lack of post-secondary options here, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And then among young workers, the share with an apprenticeship or trade certificate is 5%, so 5% of everybody aged 25 to 34. And then if you look at the older age cohort, it's 8%. So those are relatively small numbers, but there's a big difference between 5 and 8%. So again, this issue of trying to attract young people into jobs that are on offer, into careers that have potential in the future, is fundamental to workforce development. Key finding 14, in general, wages on offer are competitive, so I was asked to look at that. So if you look at both the regional job vacancy survey, if you look at the job demand report put together here, if you look at the census data, I've got all of that covered in this report. My conclusion is there's not a huge difference in the jobs, wages on offer here compared to the rest of the province, maybe compared to, say, Toronto, but overall, and in fact, Toronto wages, we could talk about that. Toronto wages are quite a bit suppressed in many service industries in particular. But if you look at some sectors like agriculture, manufacturing, food service, and transportation, there are wage gaps, and those sectors might have to pull up their efforts and raise their wages if they want to be able to compete with other surrounding communities in terms of attracting that talent, and some health occupations as well. So in terms of recommendations, so based on all of that data, I came up with a few recommendations. The first one is we need to continue to encourage older workers to stay in the workforce longer, but as I say here, on their own terms. So, somebody's worked in their career for 40 years, let's say. We're not just saying stay in that workforce, stay in that job for another 10 years. But there may be other things you would like to do. Maybe you work more seasonally, more part-time. Maybe you'd like to raise additional income so that you can spend a few months in the south, although we don't even have any snow here, so this is kind of the south in the context of Canada. But the point is, employers need to be more flexible. They need to provide job opportunities, workforce opportunities that are more flexible to entice older people to stay in the workforce, because most of them don't have to work full-time after the age of 60 or 65, but maybe many of them would like to keep active in a certain way. So I think that's a shift for employers, and maybe a question for them. I don't know if you asked that on the survey, but are they prepared to modify their workplace processes to adjust to older workers? We need to educate young people on a broad range of career opportunities, and I know that's done. It's a blanket statement. I know you do that on a regular basis, but if you look at those gaps, we literally need to get into the schools and say, okay, but here's where the real opportunities are going to be in the future for young people. We need to better target immigrants, including international students, to meet occupational demand and entrepreneurship opportunities. As I said earlier, all net growth across the entire country, all net growth in the workforce is coming from newcomers. So that means the people born in Canada, that they're more retiring than joining the workforce. So across the country, we're going to need more. And increasingly, those folks are coming here via post-secondary education. So this is a big trend. We now have postgraduate work permits. We have all kinds of incentives now and pathways for young people. And we need to take advantage of that here. We're at a bit of a deficit because we don't have as much post-secondary education infrastructure here. We have some. St. Clair College is doing lots of stuff here, but certainly not covering the full range of opportunities in our community. We need to address temporary workforce demand through a variety of initiatives. So there's a detailed analysis of this. If you look historically, a lot of the jobs that we're struggling to fill now, things like food service workers and so on, historically those were filled by students and by second income earners in the household. And now we have less students and somewhat less second income earners in the household. So how do you fill that? You're not going to fill those with primary household jobs, occupants, right? So we have to be thinking about that. So if you look at Western Canada, if you look at Alberta, they attract most of the workforce to work in these industries that need workers during the year. So there's lots of ways to do that. Those are discussed in the report. And then encouraging more self-employment and an entrepreneurial mindset. Increasingly, this is one important way to meet workforce demand. You can actually own your own business and meet a demand in the workforce. In terms of addressing education skills gap, so Jason talked about specific skills gap. I thought the thinking one was very interesting. That probably applies much more broadly than just our employers here. Align post-secondary education to workforce demand, that's always difficult to do. It's much easier for the colleges to do that, but really we need to align, right? Because if we're graduating a whole lot of folks that don't have the skills and education for the jobs on offer here, they will leave. seeing, even with immigrants, we're seeing more mobility now. They're just not staying in jobs that aren't aligned with their skills as much as they did in the past. Experiential learning is key. Attract more post-secondary education. You are at a disadvantage. If you look at a lot of other communities your size or larger, and if you look at the ratio of post-secondary education students in the community relative to the population size, you're on the lower end here in Chatham-Kent. So we need to be thinking about attracting more post-secondary students, not only to meet the future workforce demand, but as I said earlier, to meet the current workforce demand, the jobs that students work. And of course, the immigrants are now allowed, for example, international students are now allowed to work part-time. Most of them are allowed to work part-time, and if they bring spouses, those spouses are allowed to work. So they become this sort of tool, and increasingly colleges are attracting more international students. Exact same reason, exact same opportunity, not just universities. Okay, encourage more online learning. We don't have as much PSC infrastructure here, so we could fill those gaps with online learning. And then looking at other barriers to workforce participation, talked a little bit about childcare, talked a little bit about other issues and challenges there. But it's absolutely critical to be able to identify those. If you see gaps in the workforce, to be able to identify what those barriers are, encourage workforce participation. And then in terms of just one recommendation around ensuring competitive wages, so ensure that wage growth for occupations where there's a structural gap. So if an industry comes to you and says, look, we can't hire workers, and you show them they're paying on average 20 to 30% less than their other communities in your neighborhood, pretty good reason why you're struggling. So this is very, very important. It's not all about wages. Certainly non-wage benefits are key. If you look at a lot of the survey data, fringe benefits and flexible workplaces and things like that can be very, very important. But at the end of the day, we need to make sure our wages are reasonably competitive with our neighbors here in the region. So I think it's my last slide around the case for investing in workforce development. So I've spent nearly 30 years in economic development consulting across the country. And 20, 30 years ago, we were all focused on attracting industry. We were all focused on sort of trying to convince entrepreneurs to set up and grow their businesses. But now there's so much more going on. So I kind of feel sorry for people in economic development these days, but you can't just attract companies. You have to make sure you're attracting the workforce, you're making sure there's all these services, transportation, healthcare, housing. Otherwise, you will not grow your economy because you don't have the pieces in place to make that happen. But just in terms of the return on investment for workforce development, so quite frankly, if you look at the standard tax multipliers in Ontario, every $1 million in new direct payroll boosts government tax coffers by about $300,000. So that's local, provincial, and federal. So, it makes a lot of sense to do target investments in workforce development if you want to have a strong tax base. If you look at just municipal investment in workforce development, the same argument applies. So for every 100 jobs that are filled in Chatham-Kent as a result of workforce development efforts, it boosts municipal tax coffers by nearly $800,000 over 5 years. So take the taxes that those 100 jobs support over 5 years, that's $800,000, not including any taxes from the commercial or the industrial activity associated with jobs. So that's just the household municipal taxes paid over that 5-year period. So, obviously, if you look at how taxes are distributed, the province and the feds get a lot more of the tax pie than municipalities. But even municipalities need to be thinking about, and they are, there's no doubt that they are, how they can invest to support workforce development here in Chatham-Kent. Because without it, you can attract all the manufacturers you want, you can attract all the industry you want, but you're just going to, the labor pool is just going to fight for the same labor, and ultimately there won't be a good outcome at the end of the day. So I think I kept that within a half an hour. So I think we're going to do questions. So does anybody have any questions on that? This report will be made available in the next 2 to 3 weeks. It's about 75 pages long. I get paid by page. Make sure the reports are as long as possible. Any questions on what you saw today? We do have the mic here somewhere. Yes, thank you. Over here.
John Stixworth at the agricultural sector, and when you spoke about the addressing temporary workers, Now, would that include there's a lot of greenhouse operations going on with offshore workers, and maybe is there a plan or some kind of a something going on to try to introduce them for our local workforce and immigration and live in our community? I know it's all federally run, but maybe the employers might be interested because they're flocking over the border there in United States all the time. They're looking for a place to stay and a good life, and maybe we could show them something.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I don't know of what's going on. I mean, what's happened in the ag sector is that, particularly here in Ontario, but also Quebec and BC, over half of the laborers in agriculture are temporary foreign workers. So they come in, there's deals done with the Mexican government and the other governments, and it's very formal. They come in, they do their work, they leave. But I think the point you're making is that we're going to need more sort of people to move here, live here, and work in the agricultural sector and build their lives and their careers around agriculture. And I don't think we're doing a good enough job of that. I think we need to do a better job of that for sure. There's some of that, right? You're still seeing some even European farmers moving. I'm not sure specifically here in Chatham-Kent, but we need laborers, we need all kinds of workers. And that's an incredibly important sector of the economy. I think sometimes it gets put, even when young people are career planning, it's not as front and center, but it's an important issue, and I hope that we can work on that here. Yeah. I'm just the guy crunching the numbers, but I recommend that we make that sector sexy again, because it's very, very important to our economy.
Hi, there was an interesting slide about how many people are leaving a particular occupation and compared to who's coming into that. Now, sometimes could there not be a barrier to the fact that the jobs aren't quite available because those people haven't left, and how do you account for that in your methodology?
Yeah, it's tricky. So that specific analysis, the ratio of young people to older people, it doesn't address what you're talking about, and that is if the 55 plus are not moving out, then young people are not moving in. But it does show you, though, in general, that people aren't taking jobs in those sectors. So there can be a timing issue. But again, we know how many people are going to retire in those occupations. I mean, everybody retires eventually. So you can take that. If there's 5,000 people who are going to retire in that occupation, you better make sure you've got 5,000 coming in, particularly if it's an occupation that, where there's no productivity gains or there's nothing else going on underneath there. So I think your point is well taken, but if you don't educate folks, so first of all, the other thing is to think more regionally too, right? You can think about sort of southwestern Ontario here as a larger area in terms of workforce planning. But at the end of the day, it's pretty clear that there's a lot of occupations. So the trucking sector is a very good example of it. So what's happening right now is the trucking sector is actually consolidating in the Toronto area. If you look at the place that's adding a lot of trucking jobs, it's in Toronto because it's all immigrants, almost entirely immigrants, not all immigrants. So that's really what happens if we don't address it here. If you don't want truckers in the community, just then don't train any, and they'll all be depoted out of Toronto. Because what happened, this is the same in Atlantic Canada, right? And they used to be depoted in Moncton. Increasingly now they're in Mississauga. They're doing the same run. They're doing the Atlantic Canada, the Central Canada run. But just where they live physically is going to be increasingly in Greater Toronto because that's where the immigrants are. And so that's a discussion for community leaders here. If you don't want those sectors, if you're okay to let those sectors and occupations happen in Toronto, it's fine, if that's your decision. My argument would be no. If you've got companies here, manufacturers that need truckers and other agricultural products that have to be shipped to market, let's make sure we have the truckers here to meet that demand. Hope that answered your question somewhat. Other questions? Okay, sorry.
I'll shout it out to you, maybe you can repeat it.
Okay.
Could you comment, please, David, on participation of Gen Z in the workforce? So that 15 to 19.
Right, yes. So we do have, thanks for raising that. We do actually have, if you look at the workforce, we have higher workforce participation at the very young, 15 to 19, and at the very old, 65 plus. And then in the middle, we have lower participation. So that's kind of an interesting dynamic that you don't see in every community. When I looked at the participation rate by sector, you have more young people, 15 to 19, working in the ag sector. So it's only 12%, but it's like 3% across the province. So I think that's partly responsible for that, but yes, we have a higher rate. Now that could be things like more affluent parents in, say, the GTA, not requiring their kids to work, their high school kids to work, whereas here, the parents may be saying you need to work, right? And that might be driving up those participation rate among the 15 to 19. I'm a big fan of high school students working, at least part-time. You know, we've seen a lot of young people actually getting into the workforce with no formal work experience. And so it's nice, I think, if possible, for young people to work. And also, it meets demand. You know, a lot of the jobs on offer require that kind of skill set, quite frankly. I mean, you know, you don't want primary income earners working cash at Burger King. Sometimes it happens, but it's not ideal. Ideally, that's a student or that's a second income earner in the household. Okay, thanks, folks.